In the late 1950s, rock and roll dominated the charts, though it was nothing like the rock of the 1960s. 50s rock was notorious for recycling the same chord progressions and lyrical subject matter. Even artists like Elvis, who stood out for being distinct, still stuck to fairly routine formulas in their music. Elvis also never aged until he became Fat Elvis in the 70s, when he very suddenly aged a lot, which may lead one to believe that he was actually a mannequin made out of wax, and he got too close to a hot source of light at some point in the early 70s, causing him to melt. However, I must inform you there is only about a 15% chance that this is the case. So what exactly changed the musical scene? What brought about the creatively overstuffed decade we know as the 60s? Well, by artificially combing over the charts from this time, or part 1 of this video, you may be led to believe that this change was brought about by artists like the Beatles or Bob Dylan. And while these artists were definitely incredibly influential, that's not the whole story. The truth lies beneath what was visibly popular on a mainstream level, at least. Believe it or not, but in the 1950s, the United States was quite racist. Having been all but excluded from white musical culture, the African American community developed their own musical culture, 2 of the most prominent genres being jazz and blues, which white Americans expressed their disdain for, until they realized that they actually wanted to make it. Since black people hadn't been allowed to take part in white churches for the past 100 years, what did they do? They formed their own churches. And instead of singing the same ass songs from 12th century France over and over, they decided to make their own songs. These new songs of piety were even more upbeat and harmonic, often employing the pentatonic scale in their melodies. So cutting back to the late 50s, after nearly 100 years of singing these songs in church every Sunday, various musicians, such as one Ray Charles, pondered upon ways this method of songwriting could be utilized outside of the church. Now, in case you're a big fucking idiot dummy, you don't know anything about Ray Charles, he'd spent his whole life blind, which meant that music essentially was his world. He'd always excelled in combining things musically. Hell, if he wanted to learn anything on piano, he'd have to learn one hand at a time while reading the music with his other hand, and then vice versa, later putting the 2 parts together in his head. So when he combined gospel with blues in the mid-1950s, something entirely new was birthed. Similarly to mixing 2 different colors of paint, this new soulful genre would come to be known as soul music. It took many aspects from gospel music, but downplayed that whole, religious part of it, instead employing lyrics that you'd find in a rock song. It went as far as some previously existing gospel songs simply being repackaged as soul songs. For instance, I've Got a Savior, Way Across Jordan became I've Got a Woman, Way Across Town. Heretic. Entering into the 1960s, various other soul artists began to crop up, namely James Brown. He did stuff, some of which included being a terrible human being, but that's besides the point, since he was the most popular soul artist of the early 60s, and debatably of all time. And as you can tell from his necklace, he's a big Justin Bieber fan. Throughout the early 60s, some of the most influential soul albums of all time were recorded, going on not just to define the future of R&B, but the future of rock and pop as well. Artists like Roy Orbison, who debuted in 1961, were directly inspired by this new soul music. And bands like The Temptations would go on to define soul as a genre in general. So why am I mentioning this at the beginning of part 2? Well, for 2 reasons. 1, because the rise of soul is a great prelude to the rock explosion of the late 60s that it directly influenced. And 2, because I somehow forgot to talk about it in part 1. Anyways, fast forwarding through the rest of the decade, we get Chuck Berry doing his thing, the Cold War raging, the British invasion, Beatlemania, the 12-bar blues dying and being replaced by power chords, rivalries, the inception of acid, and that brings us to 1966. If the early 60s was all about trying to spark change, the late 60s was all about actually seeing that change. 1966 didn't feel especially different from 65 at the time, but there were a few telltale signs that shit was about to hit the fan. In December of 65, the Beatles had released Rubber Soul, which was vastly more experimental and folk-inspired of an album than their prior works. Rubber Soul was also the first Beatles album to contain at least one song. One single song that wasn't a love song. Though things had seemed to be going well for the Beatles at the time, it came out around this time that John Lennon hated Jesus, and also hated babies, and also supported Hitler, and probably supported Gaddafi too. So the American people were like, whoa, you can't just say that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus, you fucking Satanist. What kind of Satanist would say something like that? We're gonna burn all your shit, Satanist. Then they went to the Philippines and almost all died via angry crowds because they accidentally snubbed the military dictator, and thought to themselves, you know what, fuck this whole touring thing. Come spring of 1966, and it was only a matter of time until someone played off the Rubber Soul sound in a meaningful way. Remember the Beach Boys from what I mentioned earlier, how they liked stealing Chuck Berry songs? Well, the head of the group, Brian Wilson, thought to himself, what if we made a song that's not about surfing? Whoa, I might be onto something. 9 months of intensive recording later, the Beach Boys had created something that sounded dynamic and unlike anything had before.
Well, on Pet Sounds, which is generally considered an interpretation of the Phil Spector recording style, or utilizing instruments, combining, say, pianos with guitars to form a unique instrument. In other words, if you combine them electronically well enough, you're not going to have a guitar or a piano. You're going to have piano-guitar, a new instrument.
It combined psychedelia, beach rock, and to some extent soul to create an entirely new sound. The album was released in May of 1966. Did it cause critics to jizz their pants? Did it go platinum within a week? Did it give rise to a new era of music? Nah, everyone just kind of ignored it when it came out. A few months later, the Beach Boys dropped their hot new single, Good Vibrations. Brian Wilson staked a lot on the release of this song. It exemplified the sound the band had developed on Pet Sounds, but reworked the structure of an average pop song. How did it do? Upon its release, Good Vibrations sailed to the top of the charts. Now the world was paying attention. Though Pet Sounds hadn't been able to mold a new wave of pop music on its own, with the help of Good Vibrations, everything changed. Come summer of 1966, and it was only a matter of time until someone played off the Pet Sound sound in a meaningful way. Remember the Beatles? Yeah, you probably remember them. Well, they decided to take the whole drug thing to a whole new level with their Beach Boys-inspired magnum opus, Revolver. It was clear that the Beatles had a new pair of rivals. Also, Cream released an album, but with the exception of one song, no one really cared. Something feels a little freaky around here. Oh, Frank Zappa just released his debut album with The Mothers of Invention, an album that pushed the boundaries of what could be classified as music. And the critics hated it. Job well done, said Frank to himself. This continued the clear trend of everyone's albums getting a little trippier, and the more sophisticated adults were starting to disapprove wholeheartedly of what their children were listening to, and also putting in their bloodstreams. But don't worry, it wasn't nearly as bad in 1966 as it would eventually get. Meanwhile, in a musty dark room somewhere in the USA, a bunch of displeased capitalists stared angrily down at a copy of Rubber Soul. Why is it that these goddamn Brits should hold so much influence over our culture? They thought to themselves, it's un-American. How do we fix this? And then it came to them. Why don't we manufacture our own Beatles? An all-American version of the Beatles who will keep their hair short and bring all of their capital back to Washington as opposed to London. So then they made the Monkees.
Hey, we're the Monkees, and people say we monkey around.
No one likes the Monkees. Tim Buckley. You like soul? Well, one of soul's emerging frontrunners was this dude Otis Redding. Redding had dropped out of school when he was 15 to support his family, and was only able to break onto the music scene by winning a talent show, which had an insane, gargantuan cash money prize of $5. Redding had a voice so hypnotizing that it would go on to become a defining sound in R&B. The genre, along with the rest of R&B, was evolving, becoming a little less gospel and perhaps a little more funky? But not funk yet, though. That's not until later. Then this little band called the Yardbirds, not to be confused with the Birds, who really liked Bob Dylan songs, swapped out one of their guitarists for Jimmy Page, who then had to swap roles, becoming the only lead guitarist when the other guitarist Chetback left the group, and would then go on to plant his seeds in the band until he could swap out the entire band with Led Zeppelin. But hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves here, haha. Also, John Lennon met a pretty Japanese woman who's into avant-garde shit at one of her art shows. When she realized who she was dealing with, she decided to plant a few seeds of her own. But of all the seeds planted around this time, easily the most influential was the one planted by... Knock knock. It's Jimi Hendrix, motherfucker. Fresh out of the military, James Jimothy Marshall Hendrix, with his debut single, Hey Joe. Let me just say this. Everyone's impression of what a rock guitarist is and how they play the guitar, it all started with this dude. Is it just me, or did it just get cold in here? Oh, look at that. Everyone's favorite cold-blooded demon monster just formed a band. What's the band called? The Doors.
The Doors?
Yes, The Doors. Like the doors into your mind. The Doors found their beginnings in 1966, gaining prominence for their, shall we say, flavorful performances at the Whiskey A Go-Go. Until, of course, one of their performances was a little too flavorful.
Jim says, "Mother, I want to," and he shouts out the F word with all the gusto he possibly can.
And they got banned for life. It didn't matter though, because somehow they managed to secure a deal with Elektra Records after a talent scout observed them at one of their shows. After a year of work and unique recording techniques,
He comes across the TV set, and he picks it up and throws it right at the recording studio window. And I thought, oh.
The Doors dropped their self-titled LP on January 4th, 1967. Like their performances, the album was a taste of a previously unheard branch of psychedelia, drawing heavily from Eastern music. It caught people's attention, to say the least. And then it stuck in their heads. And then it wouldn't leave their heads. Until Light My Fire shattered all expectations and secured a #1 spot on the charts. Suddenly, Jim Morrison found himself not a peasant, not even a prince, but a king. Seeing the undeniable success of this new bizarre band, Ed Sullivan invited them onto his show, a performance in which Jim Morrison went against his instructions not to use the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," causing the Doors to be banned for life. Thank God Ed was there to save us from the word higher. Nice, said Eric Clapton, who was mad that no one cared about his first album, so began work on a cooler, sleeker second album. Hold on, let's just take a step back here. The year we're in is 1967, yes? You don't even know how much shit I have to talk about in this year alone. Like, 1967 could be its own damn video. Forgive me, but just this once. I must initiate Blitzkrieg. In January, the Stones released Between the Buttons, which was a change in direction for the band's sound, opting for more melodic and conceptual music, also Roy Orbison. In February, Jefferson Airplane released their psychedelic masterpiece, Surrealistic Pillow. It's still considered the quintessential drug album to this day. Then in March, Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground released the whimsically dark Velvet Underground and Nico. We'll talk more about them later. Also this month, Grateful Dead burst onto the scene with their first album. Also this month, Aretha Franklin dropped her quintessential I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. Nothing especially important happened in April. Then in May, it happened. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It influenced music a little bit, you know. Changed some stuff here and there, cemented this new wave of music, was one of the most ambitiously produced albums of all time, if not the most at the time, had one of the most iconic covers of all time, hit #1 and stayed there for 23 consecutive weeks, you know, some stuff. But that wasn't all May had up its sleeve. Get ready for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Never before had the electric guitar been utilized in this manner, with Eric Clapton coming the closest. Hendrix could do things with 6 strings that most men could only dream of. Then in June, this dude you may know called David Bowie released his debut album, also Roy Orbison again. In July, the Bee Gees released their debut. In August, Pink Floyd released their debut. We'll get back to them. Remember the Beach Boys? Well, it was only a matter of time until someone played off the Revolver sound in a meaningful way. And come September they did, with a similarly inventive Smiley Smile. Whilst in October, the Doors followed up their self-titled LP with the expansive Strange Days. Speaking of Morrisons, Van Morrison popped out his debut. And also in October, Roy Orbison released stuff yet again. Also King Crimson.
Oh my God! Wow!
In November, the Beatles dropped Magical Mystery Tour, which was accompanied by a movie, as well as the esteemed Forever Changes by Love. And finally, in December, Hendrix, Axis, Bold as Love. Then Leonard Cohen made some songs and stuff. And lastly, the Stones dropped their Satanic Majesty's Request, which was trying really hard to be Sgt. Pepper's and completely failed. She's a Rainbow is a banger though. But those are just the releases. There's more to 1967 than just that. As you may know, psychedelic drugs were kinda in at the time. So it was only a matter of time until once wholesome and family-friendly groups were perverted by the devil's lettuce and his tablets and his sugar and his mushroom. So it came as a bit of a shock, but also no shock at all, when Paul McCartney revealed in an interview that the 4 of them had dropped acid on various occasions.
Have you taken LSD?
About 4 times. But the thing is, that I was asked a question by a newspaper. And the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, you know. I decided to tell him the truth.
What was even less of a shock is when 2 months later, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were arrested for drug possession and banned from the USA. That totally lasted. Some bands, however, embraced this psychedelic image, incorporating it fully into their band's public image. And one of these bands was Pink Floyd, led by Syd Barrett. Syd wasn't your typical band leader. Usually you'd find a band leader leading, but Barrett was different. This was a man who did not give two shits about what people thought of him, because he was cool, and also because he was always on 5 tabs of acid at every moment of every day. Pink Floyd found their traction playing to underground gatherings who took to their music for how sheerly experimental and trippy their songs were. So when it came time to put out a debut record, the band naturally wanted to emulate the chaotic live sound that they were known for. But at the same time, they wanted to add an extra layer of trippiness that could only be possible with a studio-produced project. The end result was The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which garnered a small amount of critical acclaim and success upon release, but wasn't really enough to truly propel the band into stardom. They were being held back by the fact that their sound was so experimental, it wasn't likely to get any radio player spread through any mainstream music market. That and the fact that their leader was always on 5 tabs of acid and was undergoing the process of completely losing his mind. But as the experimental rock and roll scene was concerned, Pink Floyd was nowhere near the most underground. So, quick side tangent, back in 1965, this motherfucker Andy Warhol was looking for rare avant-garde Korean audio sex tapes from the 1920s that he could jack off to when he stumbled across a little band named the Velvet Underground. They had named themselves this after a book about the taboo underground sexual culture of the early 60s. Andy was a fan of how artistic their music sounded and how they used long droning chords as opposed to tight, rigid melodies. Without a moment's hesitation, he contacted the band and offered to be their producer, going as far as to score them a recording contract with Verve Records. The lead singer of the group, Lou Reed, was distinctive for his deadpan vocals, so to complement this, Warhol invited the similarly monotone German singer Nico to sing on 3 tracks of their upcoming album. Then they made this banana album or something. I don't know, man. Who puts a banana on their album cover? A bunch of losers. Designed by Warhol, the banana on the cover could be removed, revealing a red banana underneath, with a message to indicate this reading, "Peel slowly and see." The album is also distinctive for its unique drumming style, performed by Maureen Tucker, who had previously experimented with garbage cans as drum sets whilst on tour. Not many albums dealt with the kind of themes that the Velvet Underground and Nico did. The album, as you may have guessed from the controversial subject matter, completely failed financially, failing to sell a significant quantity of copies wherever it wasn't already banned. Don't worry though, people these days are edgy, so they do listen to it. Were you keeping this album in mind, like I said? Good, because since he had released it, John Coltrane had continued to push the boundaries of jazz with his avant-garde style. The way he constructed nuanced and complex tangents with his soprano saxophone, undercut by chaotic drumming and piano melodies, was something previously, for the most part, unseen, and a little terrifying. Throughout '66, his performances had only gotten wackier and wackier, with the man consistently producing sounds from his saxophone which sounded more akin to a dying animal than a musical instrument. But like in a good, cool, experimental way, though, is what I mean. It's easy to see why Coltrane is one of the most revered jazz performers of all time. So I know what you're thinking. Come 1967, the most famously explosive year in recent music history, and he must have gotten up to making his wackiest shit yet, right? No, he died of cancer instead. Shit really sucks, bro. And continuing the theme of shit sucking, around late August, longtime manager of the Beatles, Brian Epstein, died. It is unknown whether or not he committed suicide. This is not a reference to anything, I swear. The loss of Brian shook the group to their core and later made them realize that they needed to go on some kind of spiritual retreat to clear their minds. In the mid-1960s, music labels had become aware that bands were so popular that they could expand to other mediums and still go platinum. Case in point, the Beatles' hugely successful movie, Our Day's Night, or their other successful movie, Help, or their TV show, or the Monkees TV show, which was in no way playing off the Beatles TV show because it was a completely original idea. But would this still work for mainstream audiences with the rising levels of drug and anti-war influences that the music scene had embraced? Magical Mystery Tour, the film, was an answer to that question. No, because everyone hated it and it bombed. But by far the saddest event of 1967, the Trashmen disbanded. Who were the Trashmen? Well, I was under the impression that everyone had heard. About the bird. The bird's a winner when the bird. Yeah, there they are. Trashman. Fitting name. The actual saddest event of 1967, however, was the infamous plane ride taken by a promising R&B band called the Bar-Kays, as well as Otis Redding. It had been a long, rainy day, and Otis wanted... Actually, I'm just going to cut to the chase here. The plane crashed and they all died. It really sucks. If you like happy endings, you probably shouldn't be watching this video. Hey, speaking of stuff going badly, Roy Orbison's house just burned down, and his marriage is failing, and his career is failing. This was a cruel time. Anyways, do you want to know how many huge bands formed this year on top of all the other shit? The Stooges, Sly Stone, Jethro Tull, Genesis, CCR, Nirvana... Wait, what? Nirvana? Oh yeah, I guess there's just two Nirvanas. There's a 60s Nirvana too. Now it's 1968, and the Christian conservative US of A was really starting to push back against British influences. They had a hippie problem now, and it was all Britain's fault after all. Nothing to do with us, it was Britain. To kick off the year, notorious badass and non-hippie Johnny Cash performed his most famous ever concert at the Folsom State Prison in California, which was later turned into an album. This performance/album was a big deal for his career since the man hadn't exactly been doing too hot as of late. Cash had become fascinated with the concept of prison life while serving in the Air Force, and strived to accurately depict what it must be like through his music. And then he was all like, what if I actually performed it in front of a bunch of actual prisoners just to rub it in? Lol. The album was critically acclaimed upon release a few months later, giving Cash's career the second wind he so badly needed. But ironically, had he become a prisoner to the industry? Probably not. He was Johnny Cash. He could do whatever the fuck he wanted. The US wasn't the only country reeling from British influence. France, like many other European countries, had followed suit with this new psychedelic 60s sound. Throughout 1967, many French hits such as L'amour est bleu took a more soft and gentle approach when it came to emulating the kaleidoscopic sound of the late 60s. And come 1968, the world saw more of the same, except that more and more French musicians were starting to sing their songs in English. The same thing was happening throughout the rest of Europe, including Germany, which was on the rise as a music hotspot. Why English? Well, because it was clear at this point that charting in the USA was kind of the gateway through which music could reach the rest of the world. Sorry, European people. Then Lou Reed was like, let's just fucking make the weirdest album of all time. So then they did that. So the Beatles, they're still kind of sad about Brian's death. So they do what any rational men would do to distract themselves. Go to India and surround themselves with people doing weird sex stuff, and then write songs about weird sex stuff that they saw in India. Thank God some people know how to deal with grief. I'm looking at you, Roy. Simon and Garfunkel. They had become household names, what with their hauntingly lush vocal harmonies and poetic lyrics. And they were also charting really well in Japan for some reason. But Art Garfunkel was starting to feel a little peeved about it all. Why? Well, when he heard the words Simon and Garfunkel, to him it sounded a bit more like 80% Simon and 20% Garfunkel. I mean, damn, Paul Simon wrote the songs, wrote the lyrics, played the guitar lines, and generally sang the lead vocals, whilst more often than not, Garfunkel was relegated to backup harmonies. And this did not please him. Even so, they still released one of their most acclaimed and successful projects that year, Bookends, which hit #1 in the US and the UK. It has probably occurred to you at this point that this whole 60s rock scene seemed to be a bit of a sausage fest, no? I mean, I guess there were acts like the Supremes, or artists like Aretha Franklin, but they didn't chart as well as many of their contemporaries for 60s reasons. Enter Janis Joplin. She had one of the meanest, leanest, keenest, Venus, penis voices in blues rock. She lit up stages in ways not many other artists did, save for Hendrix, of course. I've just received word that someone has entered the building. Get down on one knee, because the king is back, baby. That's right, ya boy Elvis decided that throwing beer bottles at TVs wasn't doing him justice. So he did what any artist would do, hosted a comeback special. Except unlike every other artist that tries to host a comeback special, this one actually worked. The secret to Elvis' success on stage was that he would actually sweat so much that he could drink it to sustain himself like a vampire. They call him Infinity Presley because through utilizing this method, he could theoretically go on forever, akin to a zebrafish. I know what you're all thinking. How does Bob Dylan factor into this? Well, truth be told, he was too busy trying to figure out how to turn himself into a teapot using only acid to make music around this time. But his band certainly wasn't resting. Which band? The Band, who defined the Southern American rock sound despite secretly actually being Canadian. But back to Dylan, it had been becoming very clear over the past few years that he was very easy to make fun of.
Everybody must get stoned.
So everyone had kind of started making fun of him.
But it's alright, Ma. Everybody must get stoned.
And the filthy war in Vietnam, and were persecuted and finally forced to seek refuge in another country. Wow, sounds like a ballad to me.
I'm no man's brains so smart. You couldn't think of nothing at all.
Meanwhile, three folk-loving Californian guys called Crosby, Stills, and Nash made a band, and after months of consideration, come up with the genius name, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But even with all that, not nearly as much happened in 1968 as did in 67 or 69 that's noteworthy. And for some reason, basically all the important stuff happened in November, so we can just skip to then, I guess. Whoa, the Kinks are back. And they're gone again. Whoa, Van Morrison just made an album that's actually really good the whole way through, as opposed to a little bit of a mixed bag. Whoa, Eric Clapton's band Cream just broke up. What's his name, Clapton? Man, obviously has no chance of making it on his own. Get out of here. Now, as many of you will know, the Beatles made history when they all collectively put their feet down and said, no, we're not going to perform to segregated crowds. But John and Paul felt they'd been a little too not racist for the 60s, so they decided to balance it out by titling their next project The White Album. Just a disgusting move from the Beatles here. I hope you guys are ashamed of yourself. Guys, it's 1969 and the Vietnam War is still going. This is not very cash money of you, Nixon. Please stop the war. We will keep making songs about it until you stop the war. Thank you. Sincerely, basically just CCR and a bunch of prog rock bands. Alright, so, the Yardbirds. They'd completely reformed. New Yardbirds, you could say. But please don't say that, because that name is terrible. And this clearly occurred to them because in late 1968, they decided to rename themselves to the vastly superior name, Led Zeppelin, after a joke told by Who drummer Keith Moon. Their first self-titled album sampled a more controlled yet hard and gritty sounding form of rock, taking after blues performers such as Muddy Waters. Meanwhile, Pete Best had had enough of the Beatles and their bullshit, what with dissing him in interviews and refusal to acknowledge his contribution to the band in the early stages.
We were pretty sick of Pete Best too, because he was a lousy drummer, you know. He never improved, you know. And we were always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer, you know.
So he sued them, agreeing on an out-of-court settlement of roughly $18 million, which the Beatles, for the most part, never paid him. History has not been kind to this man. Feeling laid back? Well, then you may enjoy the fine tunes of Mr. Sly Stone and his stoned family, the Family Stone, since 1969 marked the release of Stand, which went on to sell far more copies than the label expected. One thing was clear, funk was here to stay. And speaking of things that caught on, The Who just released a rock opera, one of the first rock operas at that, which I resent them for. Though this album is still rich and full of iconic Who songs. Yo, what up? My name's Captain Beefheart, and you think you have the weirdest album, Lou Reed? You would be incorrect in that assessment. Trout Mask Replica by Captain Beefheart subverted what music was supposed to be in a way that Frank Zappa could only have dreamt of. Listen to it. I don't even know how to describe it. Just go listen to it. It'll be an experience for you. John Lennon and Yoko Ono don't like the Vietnam War, but they don't know how to stop it, so they decide to just lie in bed and make that the whole point of their campaign. And spying on them the whole time through a giant pair of binoculars was none other than Mick Jagger, trying to figure out how he could make his own version of this somehow. Mick was feeling pretty good at that moment in time, since he and the rest of the band had just fired Brian Jones for being difficult and constantly absent from band recording sessions. In fact, he'd tapped out of reality so much as of late that he didn't even appear to know how to tune a guitar anymore. But after parting ways with the band, it seemed as if he planned to turn... What? They found him floating in a pool dead? Oh shit. Well, guess we'll have to replace him then. How about this dude, Mick Taylor? His name is Mick, so that must mean he's up to the task. Mods versus rockers.
Knockers.
The conflict had gotten a decent amount of British media attention around 1964. In short, mods were more psychedelic, hippie sort of rock fans, whilst rockers were more of the 50s bluesy, greaser kind of rock fan. That's a huge oversimplification right there. The two subcultures had literally gone to war in 1964. Though the two factions had seemingly disintegrated in the time since, The aftermath of the two warring tribes still very plainly existed, though at that point the more 50s-inspired rockers had pretty much capitulated as a faction. But a new faction of people who didn't like mainstream music were rising up. However, they were pretty much on the opposite end of the rock spectrum from rockers. Since 1967, psychedelic, more passive mod rock had been dominating the charts. I mean, there were some more gritty bands popping up here and there like Steppenwolf, and ironically, the Beatles of all bands may have pioneered heavy metal with Helter Skelter. But these occurrences were few and far between. This new legion wasn't just gonna sit down and let this happen. Rock music wasn't supposed to be R&B. There wasn't supposed to be a positive message in a rock song. They weren't supposed to sing about raccoons. God damn you, mods! They yelled to the skies. But the game wasn't up just yet. Various individuals got down to business crafting more doomer, gritty-sounding rock music. Not quite punk rock yet, but what they were cooking up would later come to be known in the dog-eared, cum-stained rock history books as pre-punk. 3 bands stand out from the rest of these pre-punk groups in terms of influence, those being the Stooges, MC5, and Can, 2 of which are from Detroit. Not Can though, they're a bunch of krauts. The Stooges, led by Iggy Pop, were accused of poisoning the youth and being anti-education. So to disprove this, Iggy would commonly helpfully take out his penis during shows to teach the children of America about male biology. What a great dude. Jim Morrison took note of this, as you may have noticed. Rock music didn't quite sound the same as it did 9 years ago at this point. I mean, we started with the 12-bar blues. And then in the mid-60s it was all about them power chords. But now in 1969, rock music droned. It wasn't just rock, however. Jazz had changed too. To be honest, practically every contemporary genre had shifted in terms of sound to some extent. And the adults, who still listened to 40s swing, weren't having any of it. They'd tolerated this for an entire decade, but now it was the climax. This was war. So they took up arms, got into formation, and what did they do? That's right, they wrote some very angry think pieces about it in the newspaper. Clearly, the first shots of the war had been fired. So the boomers, it's weird to think of boomers as being young. Anyways, the young boomers decided they needed a day off, or better yet, 3 days off. Where? How about New York? Specifically this giant open muddy field. And we could get a bunch of bands and artists to perform there. Yeah, wouldn't that be great? It would just be us, some musicians, some magic mushrooms, your bare tits, and my exposed erect dick. Let's name it Woodstock, actually, in honor of my dick. And then it started. Woodstock, 1969. Richie Havens, Grateful Dead, CCR, Janis Joplin, Sly and the Family Stone, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, The Band, Crosby, Stills and Nash with Neil Young. And finally, as the sun rose after a long night of music on the 3rd day, Hendrix, playing the Star-Spangled Banner, but in like a cool anti-Vietnam War type of way. I mean, in many ways, Woodstock was a disaster. There wasn't enough space for everyone, last-minute rescheduling had to be made, it rained during the first day, but no one really cared, for 2 reasons. 1, acid. But 2, because something like this had never really happened before, and everyone was just happy to have taken part in it. People who were there report that it was one of the strongest senses of community between strangers they'd ever experienced. And from watching the footage, that certainly would appear to be the case. And you know, something like this would never really happen again in musical history. Woodstock took place just as the young musical listening community was more unified than ever. And after many conflicts of the decade had ended, but before many conflicts of the following decade would begin. It was just one of those one-time things. So, if you didn't live through it, sucks to suck. Then Mick Jagger was like, I want to do my own version of that. So then he tried, but he hired Hell's Angels as guards, and it didn't go well. As the 60s were closing, various iconic acts were splitting up. As mentioned, the Stones had reformed without Brian Jones, reverting their sound away from psychedelia and more towards their trademark blues. But that wasn't even scratching the surface. Most notably, the Beatles' working relations had become, less than ideal.
John, stop fucking bringing Yoko to every goddamn practice! Oh, I'm sorry, George, that I'm not busy trading wives with Eric Clapton!
So after recording one last album together, they parted ways forever. This last album of theirs, Abbey Road, employed the most ambitious sonic production of any of their albums, going as far as to be one of the first uses of a synthesizer ever. Yeah, fuck you, Mellotron, it's all about synthesizers now. Abbey Road is commonly cited as the best Beatles album, But most importantly, it's also proof that Paul died in 1966 because he's not wearing any shoes on the cover, which is absolute proof. Across the Atlantic, Simon and Garfunkel were also beginning to resent each other, and though they'd similarly release one last album together, to be released in 1970, after that the duo officially split for good. Except for this one song in 1975. Though old bands were crumbling to the ground, new acts that had been gaining traction as of late were only getting bigger, going on to define the decade to come. The 60s, aka the years that changed everything, were over. The 70s were here. For God's sake, can someone please find Bob Dylan?
I've got so much honey, the bees envy me.
Mick and I have been performing together for years now, folks.
It's so nice to have you back, and
wonderful.
I think we're going to
Great
sing
to
you a
have you
little
on the
song,
show.
which it's
Yes,
really
I'm
nice.
lonely. If I ain't dead already. Woo! You know the reason
Reason why?
Cut.